chapter of Faculty of Economics, South Asian University. This student initiative regularly organizes talks, panel discussions, and other academic activities with the aim of promoting pluralism in economics as well as develop a critical approach to development economics. We are extremely delighted to have amongst us three eminent scholars who will deliver a talk on understanding India's agrarian economy, farm laws, and beyond. We all can agree that this burning issue elicits a serious discussion given the deadlock between the farmers and the government. We are sure that today's event will enrich our understanding of India's agrarian economy and how to place these laws in the broader context of India's agricultural sector and farmers' livelihoods. This will surely help us form stronger and more informed opinions about all the issues. Let me introduce our speakers to you. Professor Sukhpal Singh is professor at Center for Management in Agriculture, IIM Ahmedabad. Professor Richa Kumar is Associate Professor of Sociology and Policy Studies at IIT Delhi in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. She is also affiliated with the Network of Rural and Agrarian Studies. Professor Himanshu is Associate Professor at Center for Economic Studies and Planning, JNU. We welcome you all. So I briefly will lay out the format of the event for all of you. The speakers will address the issue for 20 minutes each. We'll open up the floor for question and answer session with the audience after this. The participants can type their questions in the chat box. We request you to please keep your questions a little specific. We'll take up those questions after the speakers have presented their views. I would also request the audience to please keep their mics off and their videos also off for a better experience. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Sukhpal Singh to begin the discussion by sharing his valuable insights. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks Rashika. Thanks for the invite to be part of this panel where I have good friends Richa and Himanshu. I don't know what differences we can bring in here, but let's try. So what I would do is I would do a sort of broad brush kind of quick overview of, generally I talk about 2 acts, not 3 acts. I would not spend too much time on ECA because to me that's not very central to the issues at hand. And then I'll give a few comments on the 2 acts and the larger concerns they raise. Yeah, so maybe I'll be able to complete that in 20 minutes. So let's say that it's not that this is for the first time that agricultural marketing reforms are being attempted. I think every participant should understand that the attempts at agricultural market reforms have been on for the last 17 years, if not more, starting with the 2003 Model APMC Act. Let me also say that you should understand some basics of the agrarian markets before we look into the specifics of these acts. So the central point in this structure is the APMC market, or what we call grain markets or dana mandis, and also the perishables called sabji mandis. So these marketplaces, physical marketplaces, have been there since the, I don't know how many decades, maybe for more than a century in some cases. But the formal regulation of this started somewhere in the 60s. And it was at the state level. As per the Constitution of India, the states are supposed to create and regulate agricultural market facilities. So APMC Act in each state, wherever it has been there, provides for regulation of such physical marketplaces. And it was, and then there are rules of the game saying how would the farmer produce be bought in terms of open auction, bidding by the potential buyers, specified charges which the buyer has to pay, specified charges which the farmer has to pay for loading, unloading, grading, weighing, and so on. and there is this another set of institutions there in the Mandi or in the APMC Mandi, which are called Kacha Aartiya and Pakka Aartiya. So these two are local entities. Kacha Aartiya is nothing but a commission agent who facilitates sale and purchase of agriculture produce between the farmer and the buyer, the first buyer from the farmer. Let's also be very clear that a lot of this regulation was more about protecting the farmer interest at the first transaction level. When farmer sold, it was more to regulate and that and ensure that farmer got his due or her due. And there's other entity called Pakka Aartiya, who is nothing but a trader, wholesale trader who also buys, unlike the Kacha Aartiya who doesn't buy. So all these are regulated, kind of commission they can charge, and they are licensed. They also have to pay some fees. They have to give some guarantees. The APMC is run by a committee, as the name suggests, Agriculture Produce Market Committee, under the Act, which I call by principle, it is an elected multi-stakeholder body. It has representatives of farmers, commission agents, traders, government, and cooperatives. And there are very vibrant elections held in many states, many agriculture states like Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka, and so on. And there are also states like Punjab, which has not held election to the APMCs for the last 40 years, it seems. So there are governance issues there in some states, but the structure by principle is supposed to be very, very democratically elected, and the committee then very effectively supposed to manage the transactions in terms of protecting the interest of various parties, especially the farmer. So the other fact of life is that despite having these regulated markets, which are about 7,000 in number now, roughly, and some states are more, some states are less, some states are more regulated, some states are less regulated, and some states have grain markets more regulated, but fruit and vegetable markets are not so well regulated. The fact of life is that only about 1/3 of the produce directly comes to APMCs from the farmer side for selling to the first buyers. The rest of the agriculture produce comes indirectly or doesn't come to the mandis at all, despite the fact that when we say there is an APMC, that necessarily means there will be a notified area, and also necessarily means there will be notified set of crops, which the APMC is supposed to regulate. So in that notified area, nobody can undertake any transaction with the farmer without taking a permission of the APMC or without the knowledge of the APMC. So anything done there without their permission or knowledge or outside the market yard or sub yard was considered illegal before 2003, unless you had taken a special permission or whatever. In 2003, Union government circulated a model APMC Act to the states. So it's called Agriculture Produce Market Regulation Act, saying that now times are changing. We need to open up markets. This one mandi cannot really do the job because you need to competitively discover prices for farmer benefit. So let's allow new channels. So 3 new channels were suggested and provided for in the Model Act, being contract farming, direct purchase, and private wholesale markets. Predominantly the 3 channels, and most states started working towards it gradually. Then somewhere around 2008, the progress was seen to be not very speedy, and some states did the amendments in their own way, which was not appreciated, but they were not as per the Model APMC Act. And then that time UPA government came up with this idea of saying, can we look at it from a constitutional angle? So I got some papers at that time saying, can we make it into a union list subject, transferring from state list? But sort of I was never for it. I'm even not for it. So some discussion took place in some circles, and then it was not pursued. I think there's no great response to that idea, saying you can't really go that way to undertake that kind of this kind of reforms, even if there are problems. So it was buried there. And then UPA floated another crazy idea. I call it crazy idea because I don't think that is the way to get anywhere. So they said, since fruits and vegetable are perishable crops, let's denotify them from the APMC regulation, that they should not be made to go through the APMC structure because they are perishable, and also it becomes costlier when you have to pay all the fees and other things. Commissions are also higher in perishable produce markets compared to grain markets. So they started suggesting to states formally and informally, saying denotify fruits and vegetables from the APMC regulation. So a lot of states did that over next few years. I'll give you the numbers also. Where do we stand now? And then in 2014-15, this NDA government again took a call saying, let's look at the speed and extent of reform being carried out by states. And then they found that, no, this is not good enough. And they want to take another sort of round at it, saying that we will float another model act now, which would be much more comprehensive and different in its orientation. So what they did was they floated an act called Agriculture, Produce and Livestock Markets, not regulation, but Promotion and Facilitation Act 2017. So that was given to states, saying now you should also include livestock produce under this regulation, not regulation anymore, that we need to facilitate the new channels. So facilitation regulation became the key thing, not the regulation. And then they also thought of another idea, which they picked up from Punjab, unfortunately, that contract farming should not be under the APMC because there is a conflict of interest between the APMC, which is the regulatory authority, which is supposed to give permission to contracting agencies. So it will not be very keen to give permissions because it will lose that amount of volumes away from the mandi, not coming to the mandi, being directly taken by the contracting agency, either with the payment of fees or without payment of fees. At least commission will not be paid on that. So they said, let us take it out from there if you want contract farming to grow faster than has been the case. I opposed it, saying there is even bigger conflict of interest when you are keeping the private wholesale market under the APMC, because that will be parallel to the APMC mandi, and there is a bigger conflict because that will directly take away the volumes from the existing APMC to the private mandi. So that should also be, by that logic, that should also be taken out of the APMC. But that was not done, and separate Contract Farming Act was floated in 2018. That was also titled differently compared to the earlier situation where it was under the APMC, within the APMC Act, with all the provisions provided there, including a model contract farming agreement being provided in the even 2003 Model Act, APMC Act, with mandatory provisions and so on, and optional provisions. This act was titled Agriculture, Produce and Livestock Contract Farming and Services Promotion and Facilitation Act 2018. So that is where we were until 2018. And some states went ahead last year, 2019, for example, Odisha, Tamil Nadu, and some other states adopted these new model acts of 2017 and 18 and enacted their own on those lines. And somewhere again, this idea was floated that we are not yet there in terms of reforming agriculture market. States are not putting entire effort. So we should look at it doing from the top. And that's why we have this ordinances first, and then bills, and now we are talking about these acts. So so there are issues. One issue is that of federal concern, whether center should have made an act or set of acts on a domain which belongs to states. The second is the very purpose of these reforms. Yeah, we will maybe talk about that if we get time. Third is the content of the acts themselves, whether what is there in it. Is it adequate, inadequate, bad or good, whatever? And what does it mean for the stakeholders in terms of implications? Yeah, so that is the set of, I think, issues. I'll just comment on a few before I stop. One is that it talks about the stated or unstated objective of one nation, one market. Yeah. We had E9 before that, which was again centrally driven, given to APMCs to be implemented, which had integrated about 10% of the total APMC market. It was a state level initiative that states APMCs were being linked to ENAM. on that, if one nation, one market was the purpose, then you already had states doing things like one license for the entire state for the buyer. What was perhaps missing, which was also not their domain, was interstate trade. Interstate trade could have been done under the union list, because there is a subject of interstate trade and commerce. If we think that agricultural marketing is about interstate trade, it's about trade and commerce. Yeah. So there's no need to do the kind of thing which has been done. The second is the whole talk about attracting private investment in agriculture markets. So my take on that is that only deregulation does not bring new investments. Investment is more about policies and incentives, and not just opening up the regulatory space. And we have seen in the context of Bihar that even after 14 years of so-called not just deregulation, but complete removal of any regulatory regime, with the repeal of the APMC Act in 2006, we have not seen any great investments coming in there. Then there are many issues with the very acts in terms of the content. That's why there are issues the farmers are raising, that how can you allow somebody just with a PAN card to come and deal with farmers' produce as a buyer? I also feel it's too much of ad hocism and too much of deregulation of freedom being given to, I call it, every Tom, Dick and Harry to deal with farmer produce. Yeah, somebody has spent 6 months on producing that crop. Anybody, you, me, and others cannot, just because simply because we have PAN card, we just can't go and say, I want to buy 6 quintals or 10 quintals or 20 quintals. So all of us have been made wholesale traders in agriculture produce overnight by this provision of ENAM. Yeah, Professor Himanshu, Professor Richa, myself, and all of you, whoever is paying income tax, are now eligible to buy agriculture produce from farmers directly without any question being asked, which is not a good reform at all. The other problem is that there is this whole issue of FPOs and cooperatives also being brought under this net. For example, they even the government even attempted to frame separate rules for FPOs for payment to their members for the farm produce they buy. Now, whose business it is to intervene in a member-owned, member-controlled business entity, which is a cooperative? Can we really tell Amul how and when to pay their milk producer members? It is nobody's business to do that. They will decide. Their general body decide, member decide. So this kind of thing also they try to do under this separate payment terms were decided for the enforced for the FPOs. Not only that, the way FPOs have been treated very shabbily in this, that they have been clubbed with the farmer under the definition of farmer, whether cooperatives or producer companies or any other category of FPO. Now, how can you put an aggregating body of producers which is supposed to deal with markets, either buying or selling, as a supplier? They are legitimately supposed to be buying agents also, because they also buy from their members. So they have been given only the supplier role, which is very, very problematic. That means you have not, one side you're promoting FPOs, on the other side you don't want them to be on the buying side. So which is very, very problematic. I will just maybe, I think, take another 2-3 minutes. And the other part is that the way these two acts have been designed in terms of the content, it has created a lot of misperceptions and misconceptions, and some of them are genuine. Because when you define a trader and you don't differentiate between a trader and a commission agent, there is a problem. When you define contract farming in a way that it sounds like corporate farming, there is a problem. Yeah, and the way you define production agreement, it again leads to many doubts about what it is about. There are guidelines. So now, since we have moved beyond acts to the rules and then now guidelines for people to get into contracting arrangements, I want to mention it here because I've also looked at the guidelines. A sharecropper is also made a party in the contract arrangement. In guidelines written that if sharecropper is part of agreement, he should be responsible for receiving the inputs and using them on the farm. I have studied, I don't know how many dozens of contracts and contract situations. I have not come across this kind of arrangement where sharecropper is made made a party to the contract. Yeah. So there are so many of these kind of problems with the acts that one wonders. Then it even say, for example, it says that the contract will not be taken to the civil courts if there's dispute. The civil courts are barred from handling it. But the guidelines say that the contract should meet all the requirements of the contract law. Then for what? So a lot of mutually contradictory clauses and aspects of different documents which a government has come out with, which creates a lot of confusion. So if you're saying it should be sort of as good as fit for the contract law, then why should you keep it out of the civil court jurisdiction? So that is the kind of, there's so many, I maybe would come back to that if during the question answer session. Last thing I want to say is that we are already seeing the impact of this. Whatever evidence which has come from Madhya Pradesh shows that because of the unequal playing field between the APMC, the new trade area which the Trade Act has created, where there are no buying costs at all. 47 mandis in Madhya Pradesh have shut down. Another 143 mandis have lost business between 40 to 60% during the last 2 months, ever since these acts have been in force. Mandi board's revenue has come down by 64%. And farm produce is still selling at below MSP in most all crops except wheat in Madhya Pradesh during this season, last 2 seasons. Yeah, this despite the fact that the Madhya Pradesh government has also reduced the market fee from 1.5% to 0.5% now. So whatever farmers are feeling is already happening wherever there has been a good go of this acts sort of effect. Yeah, and the not only MP but other states also, paddy sale this season have been below MSP across states to the range of 47 to 83% of the farmers selling their paddy below MSP. So that tells us what is in store for us in terms of going ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Singh. You have been really keeping in mind the time of the each speaker has been allotted. Thank you so much. Your explanation has really helped us understand how the APMCs have evolved and how the markets work, how the agrarian markets work, and we have understood the concerns regarding these recent acts quite well. Thank you so much. I would like now to invite Dr. Professor Richa Kumar to please share her views about this current issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rashika. I hope you all can hear me.
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Please go
great.
ahead.
And hello, Professor Supal and Professor Himanshu. It's nice to be here together with both of you. I want to also make clear to everybody here, I'm not an economist, so I'm going to be coming in with a different perspective, hopefully adding to the discussion. And I'm sure Professor Himanshu will probably talk more about the economic aspects of, the mandi and the corporates and all of that. So I want to restrict my comments today. Basically, the title of of the seminar today is Understanding India's Agrarian Economy. And that's what broadly I am going to try and focus on. And I would like to change the title, or at least revise it in the way that I want to ask you all to pay attention to the embeddedness of agriculture in the ecology. So while we are understanding the agrarian economy, what does it actually mean to farm, and how is that related to nature and to drawing things from nature and then putting things back into nature? That's the kind of relationship that I would like to focus on. So before I go there, what I want to follow on with what Professor Supal Singh has said, and he hasn't said this exactly in the same way, but I think that's what I would draw from his talk, is that the concerns of farmers who are protesting are absolutely legitimate. That there is a serious crisis in agriculture, in the rural space in our country. And this crisis is not only a crisis of farming, it is a crisis of rural life livelihoods, not only in the agrarian sector, but in the non-agrarian rural sector also. And there are important reasons, policies in the last 40-50 years, especially surrounding agriculture and the rural, have contributed to the creation of this crisis. And what we have in fact seen in the last 2 or 3 years is multiple kinds of protests. So the protests that we are seeing now are not just one-off. From 2017 onwards, initially there were large caste-based protests from various groups, the Marathas, the Patels, the Jats, the Gujars, across the country. And a lot of this was dissatisfaction within the rural space. There was a long march in 2018, the Delhi Chalo march also in 2018, and then now, of course, this. And this is all a symptom of growing, developing, deepening distress. And I completely agree with Professor Sukhpal that the bills as they have come have not addressed any of these issues in any significant way at all. So coming back to the main concern around ecology, why is it that I bring ecology in here? And the reason I do that is because agriculture is, and of course, every other economic activity, but more so agriculture, is centered around drawing resources from nature and then putting back things into nature. And the economic model that we have functioned with in the last 40-50 years around agriculture has been generally a model of growth, which has assumed that you can draw from nature infinitely, that there are no limits in nature. And this model has basically pushed a language and a set of activities around increasing productivity in agriculture. We can trace this back historically to the Green Revolution, when high-yielding variety of seeds that were responsive to higher inputs, including water and chemical fertilizers, were brought in. Of course, at that point of time, there was an entire debate and concerns around food security. So the idea was that India hasn't been producing enough food to feed herself, so we need to push up productivity. Which is why you also had the entire regime of the Food Corporation of India that was set up around the same time to procure food to be able to supply to the public distribution system. And this is where Punjab, Haryana, and Western Uttar Pradesh were the heartland of the Green Revolution, because here you had farmers who had access to irrigation historically, farmers who had access to some kind of capital, and they became the champions of the Green Revolution. In some senses, we called upon the farmers of Punjab to feed the country, and that's what they did. Of course, we incentivized them to do this, incentivize them not only in terms of input subsidies, but also in terms of a guaranteed purchase that we did of their output. So we told them, whatever rice and wheat you grow, we will buy it. We will fill the Food Corporation of India godowns and supply it through the public distribution system. And that is how we overcame, at that point of time, our crisis related to food security. Of course, there are now debates and discussions around what else we could have done at that point of time. There are also concerns that perhaps we may not have understood our own production processes so well in terms of the data that was available, that our imports were really related to geopolitical concerns. But keeping all of that aside, we actually in some senses made a demand on the farmers of Punjab and Haryana and Western UP, and they responded to those incentives. And that is where you can historically trace back the public policy tool of the minimum support price, or the MSP, that they are now fighting for in the current agitation. So what this did, however, this push towards productivity basically converted farms into monoculture, monocropping farms. So whereas in the past you were growing multiple things on the farm, and in Punjab, if you look at historical data, there were oilseeds, there were millets, of course wheat, which had been introduced by the British in the canal colonies post the American Civil War in the 1860s, because they wanted to export that to Europe and London to make bread. But a variety of things were grown, and what you basically see happening post the Green Revolution, starting with Punjab, Haryana, and Western UP, and then moving on to other parts of the country, is a shift from mixed cropping, intercropping, to growing single crops. And this is pushed because there is demand for those particular crops, and there is guaranteed procurement by the government for those particular crops, and that facilitates their expansion across the country. The expansion of irrigation also goes hand in hand, and you have fields converted en masse from growing millets, oilseeds, pulses, and a whole variety of things, to growing these water intensive chemical input intensive crops. what we have seen, starting with the 1980s, and Professor Pal Singh is one of the earliest to, in fact, document all of this. His paper in 2000 is a very important paper in this regard, basically talking about the ecological devastation that has taken place as a result of this model. Not only in Punjab, now, of course, we have the documentation of that across the country. So monoculture farming has basically pushed farmers onto this technological treadmill. They are having to basically fight with nature, because you see, nature depends on diversity. Nature, the minute you have a single thing in nature, that becomes very susceptible to damage and death. And so nature, in fact, has worked on the principle of diversity. The more diversity there is, the more possibility of surviving into the future exists. And so if you want one single thing to survive on the farm, you need to ensure that all the nutrients and everything goes to that one particular thing, and you kill everything else. So everything else becomes a weed, or everything else becomes a pest. And so, of course, then you need more chemicals, herbicides, pesticides, which then leads to problems of pest resistance. Huge amounts of chemicals have led to soil degradation. Almost 40% of India's soil now and land is degraded across the country over these years. It's led to over extraction of groundwater. A whole host of ecological problems have come, which have basically destroyed the natural resource base of farming. So what that means is that today farmers may be extracting things from their soil and from their land, but 20 years down the line, it's not really clear whether they will in fact have those natural resources to be able to grow what they're growing today. Now you add to this the layer of climate change. And that is creating havoc in terms of the temperature, in terms of the seasons, in terms of pests, a whole host of things. I don't know how many of you who are in the Delhi Gurgaon region may remember the locust attack that took place some months ago. So we were talking about tackling so many different issues. This was in fact also felt in urban areas. So climate change has been another big whammy on this existing ecological crisis that has beset our farmers. And our farmers are really stuck in some senses, because not only do you have ecological risk of crop failure because of all of these reasons, you also have huge indebtedness across agricultural households. So this indebtedness, and I hope Professor Himanshu also talks about this a bit more. This indebtedness is also intrinsically linked to this monoculture model, because you're having to buy more and more inputs and more expensive inputs to deal with the single crop that you now have on your farm that you need to keep producing, and that then pushes you in a cycle of difficulty. Now in that case, the minimum support price and the guaranteed purchase by the government has been a boon for farmers of Punjab, Haryana, Western UP. They are the ones across the country who have benefited the most from this, because that's where predominantly these two crops, rice and wheat, have been purchased. Later on, of course, some other states like Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh have joined, and some others eventually. But these farmers have been able to survive and remain afloat on this monoculture treadmill only because you have this government support of guaranteed procurement. Farmers who are shifting to any other crop, the risk of price failure is so high. And the example of maize in Punjab is a clear example, where the maize prices are now less than half, almost half of MSP. Farmers growing maize in Punjab are not getting the MSP. So rice and wheat has become this secure farming option, with again, it's all still with its attendant problems of ecological damage and a whole host of other things. So in some senses, farmers are at a point where they need some kind of way forward. Agriculture is in some senses at a crossroads today, that we seriously need to begin to consider a way forward. The model that we are continuing today is not going to work. Neither is the productivity based model that refuses to acknowledge the embeddedness of agriculture within nature. That model is not going to work ad infinitum, as well as the model which thinks that we'll keep giving some stops or some subsidies to farmers and somehow make the thing work. That model is also not going to be able to continue for very long into the future, and especially because, and this is something I want to point out, that historically the way the MSP policy has been implemented in this country, there are different ways to support farmers, and ultimately the point I do want to make is that we do need to support farmers to help them transition to more sustainable ways of farming and surviving in the long run. But historically, the way the MSP policy has worked is that it has helped um, fewer farmers. It's created more inequality across the country. So dryland regions, for example, have received hardly any state support, because these rice and wheat farmers were the ones who have obtained most of the state support. And it's also been ecologically devastating, because it has promoted irrigated cropping of highly water intensive crops in regions across the country that um, shouldn't be growing this. So for example, Madhya Pradesh, ever since in 2008-9, when the government started wheat procurement for food security purposes in a very strong way, well, Western Madhya Pradesh is a place where they should not be growing water intensive wheat at all. I mean, 15 years back when I was doing my field work in that area, water levels, groundwater levels were so low, people were digging for water at 400, 500, even 1,000 feet deep. A region that is already facing a water crisis is then growing more water intensive crops. This kind of incentivization has been very, very problematic. But again, from a farmer's perspective, if wheat is my risk free option that will give me at least some backup in life, then that's what I will go for. So the point broadly that I'm trying to make is that policymakers have sort of really been very have not really looked at the ecological embeddedness of farming and the implications of their policies on the ecology and on the long-term health, not only of the farm but also of farmers who are having to deal with these issues. So where do we go from here then? What is possibly the way forward? And one of the most important things that or learnings that I have had over the last several years is that we constantly feel that farmers need to change something at their end, only then things will be solved. One of the biggest learnings I've had is that farmers are basically responding to things happening around them, either to incentives from the state, which would be something like the MSP, or to incentives from markets. So a lot of farmers have actually tried tried contract farming, or a lot of farmers have shifted to, say, growing cotton, or many other, the farmers have shifted to growing maize in Punjab. So farmers respond to various kinds of market incentives, and they try to minimize their risk as much as possible. Now, unfortunately, the incentives that they are seeing are incentives from consumers like us, who have basically lost our moorings with nature, season, and ecology. So just as an example, we sitting in Delhi, we want to eat phul gobi, cauliflower, all year round. Now, cauliflower is a winter vegetable, and one should eat it in winter. But well, Delhi's cauliflower, once you don't get it from the fields around Delhi, then you're getting it from Shimla, or then you're getting it all the way from Bangalore. So we are used to, and this has also happened more and more with the advent of corporate investment in agriculture, with the advent of longer and longer supply chains, because it's seen as bringing choice. We want to be consumers who are supposedly eating a whole host and variety of things. I mean, another example is fish. We want to eat the same kind of fish all year round, without forgetting that certain months of the year fish was never fished. Fisher folk, in fact, had elaborate rituals and elaborate understandings of the cycle of fish in the sea, and rules and regulations, norms around when one could fish what, and also it was related to our consumption patterns. You didn't eat certain kinds of fish in the seasons when they were spawning and when they were propagating. So that relationship has been lost entirely. In fact, what we've become is standardized consumers, where we are expecting to get that particular kind of good looking tomato, or that particular kind of good looking chicken on our plates all year round, without any thought to its relationship to the land, to people's livelihoods, and to nature, and to our own role in it. So somewhere we have ended up creating these unsustainable supply and demand networks that are then pushing farmers to grow certain kinds of things. Farmers in Bangalore are growing tomatoes around Bangalore. In dryland regions are growing tomatoes to supply to Bangalore and even to Delhi. When again, they shouldn't be growing those tomatoes, because it's water intensive and that region doesn't have that much water. So in terms of the way forward, I think one of the most important things is, of course, first to begin recognizing that agriculture is embedded in nature and in ecology. And whatever policy making we do, we need to keep that in mind first and foremost. The second is to work with consumers like us, for us to educate ourselves and to understand what it means to consume sustainably, not only in terms of the things that we should be consuming, the relationship of that with season. One of the things that has been lost from our plates completely is millets. That of course now known as the Nutri cereals, but at one point of time they were called the core cereals. This is of course a colonial legacy for us. The colonial legacy has been about valorizing certain other kinds of cereals and demonizing these millets. Millets have also been linked to a very casteist framing, where it's generally supposed that underprivileged caste groups or marginalized caste groups are the ones who would consume millets. In some cases, even it's animal food, and it's not really fit for the elite. All of these kinds of cultural understandings also that we have about food, many of those need to be changed in relinking them back to our health as well as to the ecology. So my second point is that not only do we need to work with farmers, but we really need to work with consumers, urban consumers in particular, to understand what their kind of consumption patterns are like. And the third and last point is that we need to change our metrics of success. So to be able to recognize the embeddedness of agriculture in nature, to be able to recognize and help consumers understand what it means to be sustainable consumers, we need to begin to value different things. If we keep valuing productivity and growth to the cost of everything else, we are not going to be able to get there. So we'll need to be able to value things like ecosystem services that farmers are providing. We would need to be able to value the healthy food that they may be growing for us. We would need to value those farmers who are bringing more energy out of their farms than using up energy in growing the food that they are growing. We would need to value those farmers who are growing stuff with less water. And for all of this, not only is it that urban consumers need to participate in changing their own consumption patterns, but we really need scientists, we really need a whole host of other people to come on board, recognize the importance of ecology, the linkages to our health, and the need for a variety of knowledge practices to come through. So not only just local knowledge practices of farming communities themselves, but also scientific knowledge practices. So in some senses, we need to exhort our scientific community, which was basically at the heart of pushing all the technologies during the Green Revolution. We need to call upon them to now come forth with technologies and with knowledge that is ecologically suitable to specific regions, that is good for our health, and that can create circular economies between the rural and the urban, so that we can really finally begin to deal with things like ecological devastation, farmer livelihoods, and climate change. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kumar, for sharing with us your invaluable insights on the crucial relationship between farmers, Yeah, okay. So, you've helped us understand whether the current agricultural system is sustainable or not. How should the incentives to the farmers change? And the multiple economic, social, and ecological concerns that should be considered while approaching policy for agricultural systems. Thank you so much. We'd like to invite Professor Himanshu now to please share his insights. Thank you. We are coordinating with Professor Himanshu, and let's wait for this issue to get solved.
Maybe we can take some questions till then.
Yes, okay. So there are some questions addressed to Professor Kumar. Ma'am, a participant has questioned and requested you to expand on the geopolitical issue during the Green Revolution, which you mentioned could have been a factor to consider versus solely on yields.
Yes, I was actually just typing the answer to that question, but I am happy to, explain it. If I understood the question, I mean, well, in the sense what I was trying to talk about in terms of the geopolitics of bringing in the green revolution technology into the country. It was really more about why we chose to bring in the high yielding variety of seeds and why we chose to, go onto the pathway of productivity. It actually has to do with the 1950s and what we know as some of you may be aware, Public Law 480, PL 480, which was a law under which we were importing wheat and some other commodities from the United States. So, maybe I can give a slightly more historical context to this. Basically, when we became independent, our agriculture was in shambles. Our growth rate in agriculture was 0%, which was basically an averaging of growth in non-food crops, and then where things were growing, and in food crops where things were not growing at all, things were in fact shrinking. And so once the British left and the punitive taxation, extraction, all of that sort of was passed, the 1950s in fact saw a huge spurt in agricultural productivity in the country across. Not only, predominantly, of course, because a lot of land was brought under cultivation, some irrigation was also enhanced, but effectively a lot of the stuff that people were producing then, they had access to it. And however, when we became independent, what seared our consciousness was the Great Bengal Famine of 1943. And those of people who study this, and people of course in Bengal who remember this, older people, they talk about how the 1943 famine and the 2 or 3 million people who died in that basically put its mark on the conscience of our nation as a nation which can't feed its people. So at that point of time, theories around famine basically were theories around what is known as food availability decline. That a country doesn't have enough food, it can't feed its people, its land is unproductive, the farmers are unproductive. Of course, today in hindsight, and Professor Amartya Sen's work and some others, their work has been very crucial to helping us understand that in fact the Great Bengal Famine as well as the famines of the 1890s and 1870s and 1890s in our country were not famines because there wasn't enough food. There was enough food around. It's just that food was either, in the case of Bengal, it was sent off to Africa, or in the case of the earlier famines, food was not basically made accessible to the poorest of the poor, who are the ones who died in all of these famines. So it was really a crisis of entitlements. I guess you guys are all economists, you probably have a sense of this, that when you lose your entitlements, you can't buy the food that may be available in the market, but you cannot afford it anymore. So however, in the 60s, our understanding of all of this was still that, our land is unproductive, our farmers are unproductive. And so we also, inherited from the British this ration for public distribution system that they had started during World War II. We had a problem of surplus states in the country that were producing more food, but also deficit states that didn't have enough food to supply to the public distribution system. And here comes in the United States basically saying that, we have all this food, and their farmers are producing a great deal of food, and they said, okay, let's export it to Europe and to countries in Asia and Africa, and they basically provided it to us for free under PL 480. And so, of course, for us, this was a win-win, and for the US, that they gave away the extra food which they had, which their farmers were overproducing. We got that free food to supply to our own people in the public distribution system, and this continued fairly well till about 1965, when we made the Americans very angry because we criticized them on the Vietnam War, and then the Americans arm twisted us and said, how can you say that? We have been giving you all this food, so now we're not going to give you any more food. Something to that effect. They kind of put it on a short tether. And then we had to scramble, because by then our public distribution system was sort of dependent on all of this food that was being imported from the US, and now the Americans are arm twisting us. So in that kind of framing, when this technology came through, the high yielding varieties of seeds and their possibility came through, we chose to adopt that. We also chose to then build our own marketing system. The Food Corporation of India actually dates back to 1964, and when we decided to create a large public procurement system to take care of the food security needs of the country. So broadly, I can also refer you to an article that I have written on this, where you can get more information into other references. But I think Professor Himanshu is back, and we should hear him.
Yeah, provided you can hear me.
Yes,
can
we can.
Yes. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
We can hear you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your patience, and I hope this time it doesn't go off. And thank you for this organizing this webinar, although I'm not so comfortable with webinars, with too many of them happening almost every day. Let me begin with what Professor Sukhpal was talking about, the main acts, the 3 acts which led to the protest. And before I say more about the protests, I think there are certain things which need to be cleared as to why these protests are happening at this point of time, and why were there no protests earlier. And as Professor Sukhpal made it very, very clear, that the attempt to reform the marketing system in agriculture has been going on for the last 20 years, in fact, more than 20 years. And that's something which is 2 major differences in that. One was that before, I mean, at least in 2003, 7, or 2013, or anywhere earlier, when in 2017 as well, when this particular government was trying to reform the agricultural markets, in all of these, the attempt was to give the states the primary role. The center was not trying to dictate to anybody as to what you should be doing. And that is why these are all called model acts, which the states were free to tweak around, free to adopt, and not free to adopt. And that is why some states did adopt, some states adopted part of it, some states adopted. And all of them were actually welcomed by the farmers. If you go and talk to farmers everywhere, then they will say that, yes, there has been a massive improvement in the way the mandi system has been functioning. Markets have become much more transparent. The technology has come in, and all those things were there. I think that's where this one is very important, because this one has come not just for market reforms, it has also come along with the contract farming law and also the Essential Commodities Act. And I'll tell you why these 3 are linked. I mean, one should not look at only the APMC Act, which is what everybody is talking about, and the MSP that people are talking about. And for that, I think you'll have to understand the political economy of these reforms, why these reforms were being pushed at this point of time. There is a political economy, and I think farmers are true. Farmers are very, very correct when they say that there is a corporate angle to it. And I think this is more than obvious to anybody who has been reading newspapers. But I'll come to that a little later. But let me just clear some myths which are there on agricultural marketing, which is being spread around by various social media groups controlled by the government and the political affiliates of those. One is that the farmers will get free market, access to market, in the sense they can now go and choose wherever they want to sell. Well, honestly, farmers always had that freedom. I mean, even the old APMC Act allows farmers, and you look at each and every state APMC Act, farmers never had any restriction on storing produce, because they produce the produce and whatever agricultural produce they're doing. And nobody can stop you from saying that, okay, you can't grow 20 quintals and you can't grow 30 quintals. And if you have grown 30 quintals in your plot, whatever amount of the plot that you have every right to store it. So storing is not a problem. Farmers can sell it. That's not also a problem. That's something which is, obviously, you have produced on your own. So nobody can tell you that you have invested in it and the crop has been harvested. Now you can't sell it. All the restrictions that were there were basically on traders. So keep that in mind. Farmers are not the main beneficiary in this one. This act is mainly for the traders, because the traders had certain restrictions. And those restrictions, again, were restrictions which were imposed on keeping in mind the 2 objectives that the Indian agricultural policy had, or Indian economy policy making had. One was stable prices to the consumers, in the sense you should not be able to buy off the entire produce which is available in the economy and create some kind of a you can say you can hoard all of the produce that is there, and therefore you can create a kind of monopoly situation, and tomorrow you can blackmail the consumers. That is why the Essential Commodity Act was also there, which was basically putting some kind of a restriction of how much you can store and how much you can buy, how much of hoarding you can do, how much of limits that were imposed on that. But these were not limits which were like not to be changed. I mean, they were changed, and state government had powers to impose restrictions. So this again is something that needs to be kept in mind. So all of this was designed in a way to provide a kind of a price stability to the consumers and price stability to the farmers. And again, price stability to the farmers was supposed to be provided through a system of open, transparent auction system, which is what the mandis, APMC mandis generally have. The MSP is not something which was very much essential part of the APMC. In fact, the MSP is only working for rice and wheat and not for many other crops. And we have more than 1,000 crops which are grown. I mean, some of the crops that you may have even not even seen it, not even heard of, all these crops. And not all the crops are sold in the APMC. There are many, many crops which are sold outside the APMC. And a majority of the trade even today happens outside the APMC. APMC is basically where major crops of the states are, food grains are sold. And in many states, again, APMC is not there. I mean, Kerala doesn't have it. In Bihar, it was abolished in 2014. In Tamil Nadu, has a different system. But in many various states where the APMC is functioning, the rules and regulations are again determined by the state, where there's a huge amount of freedom that is available. The laws have been changed, and some kind of a transparency has been brought in over a period of time in the last 20 years. But we never saw anybody, any time in the last 20 years, farmers coming out on the street and saying that these reforms are bad. So what has basically changed now? Why is it that suddenly the farmers are saying that these reforms are bad? I mean, if you remember today, Prime Minister Modi has been saying that all the parties have been saying about reforms. Yes, all the parties have been talking about reforms, and that is why there have been reforms that is happening in the agricultural system. But this is where I think the problem comes in. That what is so different in these reforms? One is that it is creating kind of a dual structure. And that dual structure is that you are going to have two markets. One is the APMC market and one market just outside the APMC market, where the same commodities will be sold, but at a lesser price, because they don't have to pay mandi taxes, they don't have to pay any other taxes or the commissions or anything that is there. Now, that's purely imaginary, because no trade happens without commission. And that's something which is, again, the government will have to explain how is it going to happen. And therefore, you are creating a system where you just step out of the gate of the market, and then you basically find a market where the same thing is available for cheaper. It can't work. This is simple offer of corruption. You know from basic economics that you can't have a dual system running in the same place. If that is the same thing that is happening, then it is definitely likely to that one of the markets will collapse, the other will survive. So the farmers are very much logical. If I'm getting the same produce at a cheaper price, just outside the boundary of the mandi, then why would I go and buy in the mandi? So if I don't go and buy in the mandi, that basically means that the mandi is not earning the money that they were earning, and therefore the mandi collapses. So when they're saying that these reforms are in a way leading to a collapse of the mandi system, collapse of the agriculture produce marketing system, they are very much right. And that's something which is what has happened in all other states where, I mean, Bihar has been particularly a big example of that. Secondly, the idea that private investment will come again is something that has not been born. I mean, you know the Bihar example of it, but then look at it, think about it logically. Mandi system, creating a market yard requires land. It requires various infrastructure, storage infrastructure. It requires weighing infrastructure. It requires sorting, grading, various kind of infrastructure. Now somebody has to pay for it. And land is not something which is easily available. So if somebody private has to build a market of agricultural goods, he will also try and recover. So there cannot be any infrastructure where the government cannot, where there will be no charges for taking part in that market. This is a government, or even the earlier governments, cannot build a simple road without taking toll on it. So they charge for building the national highways because saying that that's something which is required for it. Then how do they expect the private sector to come and build a market yard and then say that, look, we are not going to charge anything? So when the government cannot do it, you are assuming that the private sector is coming to do it, is something which is again ridiculous. And that is why in Bihar there has been not a single investment in agricultural markets. That's again something which you keep in mind, that all of these promises that are being made, that suddenly there is going to be a rush of private investment, people are going to create those markets, there's not going to be anything and all sorts of things, that none of that is going to happen. I mean, simple logic, if you're a simple businessman or simple economic students, you will learn that these are things which are very important, and somebody has to create that infrastructure. The job of creating this infrastructure has always been with the government. And it is the government which has created these mandis or the APMC yards, which again are huge in some places. And that is where they basically, the infrastructure has been created. The blame that, okay, that they charge tax 2%, 3%, but that tax is used for creating that infrastructure. In Bihar, for example, let me give you a good example of that. In Bihar, the mandi tax was used not just to improve the infrastructure of the mandi inside the mandi, but they also create roads, rural roads. Before the Prime Minister Gram Sadak Yojana, the PMJSY came in, a majority of the rural roads were created by the mandis because they wanted the transfer of the agricultural produce to come to the mandis. So they created those roads. So again, something which is a myth that mandi system basically is an extractive system is not something which works. And I think also one myth I think we have been trying to clarify on many platforms. And then I think this whole, I think that the middlemen, which is there, and there is some kind of that the middlemen are the villain, they're the bloodsuckers, they take money out of you, they take the blood out of you, and the farmers are the exploitative system. And I've been asking this question, that name me one trade where there are no middlemen. For the government transaction, for example, including in defense, very much something which is very vital for the national security. You have middlemen existing for many years, but I'm not talking about those middlemen. But if you want to buy a stock market, say for example, a stock, you go to a broker. He's not, nobody sees, looks at the broker as some kind of a bloodsucker who is taking away your blood and you are going to die and all sorts of things. When you are trying to rent a house in Delhi or sell a house in London, in Delhi, or you buy a house in Delhi, or forget about Delhi, I mean any other place, in Bangalore, in Hyderabad, or any other place, you can't do it without going through a real estate agent. And they charge commission. They provide services and they charge commission. So again, that's something which is not wrong. You don't buy stuff going to the Cadbury shop and factory and buy. There are layers of people who provide those services, and finally when you come to the shopkeeper also charges commission. Without that, the shopkeeper will not run. The artiyas that you see in the mandis provide services, and those services are sorting, grading, transport, sometimes uploading, unloading, sometimes various other things. And they're professionally trained people, in the sense they have been doing it for generations. They can distinguish between various varieties of rice and tomatoes and potatoes, which for you and me in naked eye would appear to be almost similar. So again, you have to pay for those knowledges, and those knowledges, I mean, those skills need to be paid by whether it is a private market or it is a public market. So again, look at it from a different angle rather than look at everybody who is dealing with food grain as some kind of a middleman, and therefore they're exploitative. And let's be honest, even after this law comes in, you're not going to take your PAN card and just drive some 200 kilometers from Delhi and simply go and knock on anybody's door. Hey, you have cauliflower, you have potato or tomatoes. Nobody is going to do that. You need the services of people who are going to buy it from there, again do the sorting, grading, transporting, and bringing it here to your doorstep, because the most that you're going to willing to travel is go to the neighborhood shop or go to the, say for example, your mall and wherever you want to buy it. And somebody has to do that, and there is something which is very much there. So again, I think I just wanted to bring in that context, that there is so many of myths that are being propagated as if farmers I mean, since independence have not been able to sell, they have been always been chained, they've been cased and all sorts of things. Nothing of that sort has, there has always been some level of independence. And yes, the Mandi system that has been, as Sukhpal was talking about, that is supposed to be a democratic body when there is corruption, but that corruption is there in our parliamentary system as well. I mean, you have got people who have been elected who should not be elected, but we don't just simply disband the say for example the parliament and elect the richest guy and say that, look boss, why don't you run the system, why don't you run the country, because you are the most experienced one. I mean, I don't think that's how the systems work. I mean, there is need to have more accountability in the PMC systems, the Mandi systems, but simply throwing it away or diluting or weakening the Mandi system is not going to provide the solution to the problem. But what is the problem? The problem is that the farmers are not getting right prices for this produce. That really is the problem that has been hurting the farmers for the last 30 years, particularly. But at least in the last 5 years, as Richa was also talking about, or I was talking about, the number of protests, farmers' protests has jumped. I mean, the NCRB used to provide the data. That data is now 16. I mean, between 2014 to 16, the number, it went up by 8 times. And after that, you know about it, the long marches, the Mandsaur firing, I mean, all sorts of, 2018, the farmers coming to Delhi. I mean, farmers are angry simply because they're not getting prices. And they're not getting prices because the political economy system that we have, it basically has squeezed everything out of the agricultural sector. And today our agricultural sector is the least protected one, with absolutely no subsidy. I mean, very little of what you get is and that's what the farmers are fighting for, is actually not a subsidy. It is the MSP, the minimum support price system. Petroleum subsidy has been wiped out. The fertilizer subsidy has been restructured in a way which is where no farmer can get it the way they want to use it, and it has led to environmental imbalances that Richa was talking about. And these things are contributing to the cost of cultivation, because the cost of cultivation goes up, the cost of drawing water and everything that goes up. But it is unfair to blame the farmers for all of this. And I would say that for me, the farmer is, because that the only asset they have is the land, and they are as careful about the land as it could be. I mean, it's like the only asset that they have. But what is the political economy? And I think you'll have to go a little bit behind and go to the 1990s when we had the economic reforms. Before the economic reforms finally came out in full picture, at least in the early 90s, we had the system of the public distribution system. And the public distribution system was meant to provide stable consumer prices. And they used to have, other than rice and wheat, various other things, including edible oil, pulses, and various things were provided as part of the public distribution system. As part of cutting the subsidy or reforming keeping the fiscal deficit under check, the government basically decided to revamp or reform the public distribution system, where they allowed only rice and wheat to be distributed in the public distribution system. And that is where the story begins. Before that, the millets that Richa was talking about, the core cereals, so-called what they call about millets, that was being talked about, pulses, edible oil, and we were self-sufficient. We became import dependent on edible oil and pulses only after the public distribution system was completely changed and made into a rice and wheat system. So it's not like a public distribution system, it's basically a rice and wheat system. And the sugar, simply because that's the sugar lobby is. So that's where the farmers decided that, Punjab farmers decided that, look, this is where the money is. If the government is going to give support only for rice and wheat, then we are only going to grow rice and wheat. And that's where the wheat, if you look at the rice paddy cultivation in Punjab, you see the rise in paddy cultivation happening in the middle of the 90s onwards to the current period of time. But that is where the government basically went and told, I'll put it in a different way. The government went and told the Punjab farmers that, look, only if you grow paddy, I'm going to give you subsidy. And if you give you that kind of a choice to the farmers, then obviously there are going to be some repercussions in a sense. Farmers are going to choose what is more profitable. Remember, they're businessmen. Remove all the romanticization. Keep in mind that farmer, after all, earning a livelihood. And that livelihood is under threat. He has to feed his children. He has to send his children to school. They also want to study wherever they want to study. And he has his own needs that he has to fulfill. And therefore, that's what was chosen there. I'll just take 2-3 minutes more and then in a sense. So we have a system where the public distribution system was created in a way where rice and paddy became the dominant one, and that where the mandi system, it was basically through the mandi system. But in all other crops, the government did not spend any money. And that is where the basic political economy question comes in. That today the agricultural support system is only because there has been an act in the parliament, the National Food Security Act, which forces the government to provide rice and wheat to the moment the rice and wheat, the National Food Security Act, which they have been trying to tamper with and go for cash transfers. And the reason they want to go for cash transfers is that they don't even want to procure rice and wheat also. So the moment that is done, then the whole MSP system is going to collapse. And somehow the farmers realize that let's cling on to whatever little thread that is available to us. But the solution is not to finish off whatever subsidy support system that is there, but is to expand it. If you have a problem that the Punjab and Haryana farmers are growing so much of rice and wheat, why don't you go and buy it in Bihar? This particular year, 13 million tons of wheat were procured from Madhya Pradesh. Only 50,000 tons were procured from Bihar. And Bihar is also a wheat growing state. Why don't you go and procure it from Bihar? So the policies of the government have created a situation where you are now blaming the Punjab and Haryana farmers for being irresponsible, doing whatever, all sorts of names are being called upon that. But why are prices low? And I'm not talking about rice and wheat. Now I'm talking about all the crops. And this is true for all the crops. Cotton prices have been declining since October of 19. That is more than 1 year, cotton prices have been on a decline. Wheat, for which the government did procurement, prices have been declining since August. This is government data. This is official published data. That in spite of the fact that the government did a record procurement of wheat this year, between April, May, and June, wheat prices in the market have declined at least in the wholesale market, have declined. Why? Because the economy itself is not doing well. There is a collapse of the economy. The demand has gone down. And the demand has gone down because people's purchasing power have gone down. Look at the rural wages data, and that's important to keep in mind. Rural wages data very, very clearly are pointing out that in November of 2020, the real wages of agricultural laborers and non-agricultural laborers is lower than in what it was in 2015. So in 5 years, a rural worker is now getting real income, which is less than what they were getting in 5 years back. And with more than 50% of their total expenditure on food, they have cut back on their food expenditure. If you have looked at the NFHS 5 data, which is between 2015 and 2020, you know that several of our achievements in terms of improvements in terms of nutritional indicators, and we're only talking about children, we're not talking about anybody else, that has been reversed. The track record which we had, so now our nutritional status has worsened. This country has the capacity to absorb twice the amount of food grain that is currently being produced, simply because a large majority of the people simply cannot afford to do it. What the government needs to do is to procure and basically distribute in those areas, not to wind up the entire system and hand it over to the private sector. And I think that political economy is something that needs to be understood, that the government is not interested in doing this. The government is not interested in supporting the agricultural sector. It wants to hand over the agricultural sector to the corporate sector. Think about the compulsions of it. The government's stated objective, and if you read the economic newspapers, I mean the business newspapers in a sense, the two words keep coming to your mind immediately: fiscal deficit and inflation, fiscal deficit and inflation. Inflation, simply because the monetary policy is, the one target is inflation. And that is why they would like to keep inflation low. How do you keep inflation low? You keep inflation low by keeping agricultural prices low. Why? Because in the consumer price inflation, still 40% weight is of food prices. If you don't control food prices, you don't control inflation. Therefore, the government's stated objective is to keep food prices low. And if the stated objective is to keep food prices low, the only way you can do it is by basically controlling it through various means. And I'm not getting into the details of it. The other is the fiscal deficit. How do you control fiscal deficit? By reducing expenditure. And by how do you reduce expenditure? By reducing a subsidy that you are going to give. And therefore, what you're doing is that cutting down subsidy wherever you're going. So there is absolutely beyond no illusion that at some point of time, the government would like to cut down whatever the food subsidy that currently the government is giving. And this might be a precursor to various things to come at some point of time. So I think as long as these are the objectives, then the farmer is going to make loss, because you do not want the food prices to go up. The cost of input has gone up simply because petroleum subsidy has been completely wiped out. Diesel subsidy has been completely wiped out. Even though in the world market, diesel price, I mean, the raw diesel prices are 1/3 of what they were in 2013. Now, the farmer is paying more than what they were paying in 2013. Same is the case with electricity. Same is the case with the fertilizer. Fertilizer prices doubled. So if your input costs have gone up, your output prices have remained where they are, you are going to make losses. And if you're going to make losses, you will like the government to come and support. And there's nothing wrong with it. The richest countries in the world do support their agriculture. If they don't support their agriculture will collapse. And India is an outlier. The poorest countries to the richest countries do support their agriculture. We are the only ones who don't want to support our agricultural sector, do not want to give subsidy to the farming sector. And that's why this whole idea of introducing these reforms, and finally the government trying to get out of the whole thing. How will it help the corporate sector? Again, there are lots of things. I don't want to get into it. Maybe in the question answer session, I'll try and hit into it. But listen but you must try and figure out as to why were the three acts together were passed. I mean, if you simply wanted market reforms, why they say the Essential Commodity Act? I'll give you one example, hypothetical example, and then I'll end here. The hypothetical example is simply this. The government is basically saying that as part of the Essential Commodity Act, the Essential Commodity Act will apply to everybody, as in when the government feels that the prices have gone up by 100% or 50%, depending on perishable and non-perishable. But for those who have built storage capacity, so whatever storage capacity you have built, and therefore, if you have that much of storage capacity, you're allowed to hold that. And if you are storing for exports, but nobody is going to check how much you have done it for that much. So take the example of it. Say, for example, this country produces 10 million tons of onions. Take an example of it. The APMC Act allows me to go and buy through a PAN card, which essentially means that there is no recording, there is no transaction that is being recorded. And PAN cards are a dime a dozen. Everybody has a PAN card, so anybody can go it. So as a corporate, I can produce some 1 lakh PAN. I mean, ask anybody. This is what happened in demonetization. I mean, every rich person had at least hundreds of people whose Jan Dhan accounts were being used to siphon off money or to use the black money converted into white money. So I will have some, say, a lakh of PAN cards where I'll give some money to just to use your PAN card, and I buy from everywhere all the onions, and I put it in my the storage capacity that I've created, and I'm whose storage capacity I'm talking about. So I have wiped out, in a sense, I have bought every amount, every single onion that is available in this country, put in my storage, wherever it is. But prices of onion go up. Funny thing is that the government cannot do anything because everything is legal. I have bought each and everything using the PAN card, but there is no recording of it. So I don't know how many PAN cards have been used for buying how many of it. Just saying that you can go and sell it on PAN card to a farmer doesn't basically mean that there is a recording of it. So one PAN card, I can buy some millions of tons of it. Nobody is recording that. I don't have to report it in income tax. I have put all the stock. Government is aware that there are 10 million tons of onion lying in my stock, but they can't touch me simply because I am entitled to hold as much stock as possible, depending on my storage capacity, or if I say that I am willing to export these onions at some point of time. That's what monopoly capital will do. That's what monopoly capital has been trying to do. That is what the corporate sector will do. Now tell me, if that is something, a solution which is happening for onion, it can happen for anything. And you know that onions can lead to government falling. The problem will not be that you will not be able to eat an onion, or you will be able to survive without onion or not. The problem will be that the state where this is going to be there, the chief minister will be at the mercy of the person who is holding onions in his stock. And he can basically make the chief minister or even the prime minister do whatever they want to do. So I think there are larger ramifications of these laws. They're not as simple as they appear to be, and they're definitely not meant to help the agricultural sector or the farmer as everybody is claiming to be. I'll stop here. Maybe if there are questions, I'll take these questions and answer this question.
Thanks a lot, Professor Himanshu, for unpacking the political economy behind the current agricultural reforms, busting some common myths, and laying out the general broader array of problems that the agricultural sector and the farmers have been facing. We are grateful that the technical issue could be resolved and we could all listen to your views. Let me take up a batch of 3 questions from the question and answer session, and we can move on with the three question set. So first question is by Sharon. Let me address it to Professor Himanshu. Farmer suicide is a serious problem facing the country now. Farmers are already in a distressed position. How the recent acts will put them in more critical situation? That is a question I would address to Professor Himanshu. Let me raise some questions to Professor Sukhpal Singh. Professor Singh, what do you think could be the ideal way to move forward from the current impasse? And what went wrong in Bihar's approach towards agri-marketing? One more question to Professor Himanshu, maybe. Yeah. What should be the long-term and short-term solutions you would like to suggest to make agriculture remunerative and sustainable? And I would also like to request Professor Kumar to, share her views about this question, that how to make agriculture more remunerative and sustainable for short and long term. Thank you so much.
Maybe we can go in the same order. Let Professor Sukhpal answer, and then.
Sure.
We starting with Bihar first. I think it's very clear now that last 14 years, when Bihar, instead of reforming the act, abolished the act altogether, through the way with the Wath water, we have not seen any improvement in the situation there. Now there are a lot of data available in public domain. I can go through that, but I don't think that's needed. Whether you look at the number of APMC market yards, or you look at the purchase, as Himanshu also talked about, you look at variability in prices, you look at cost of marketing for the farmer, everything has only become worse. And I visited that place 2 years back. I looked at the fruit and vegetable markets. What has come into being after the abolition of the APMC markets is temporary roadside shanties, which are set up by local private traders. where farmers bring their produce or motorbikes. For the first time, I saw that farmer sellers are being charged 2% commission. No open auction is taking place, and we don't know how long these marketplaces will stay there. So you have moved the structure, which was maybe not well functioning, but it was still there. Some people were able to go and separate infrastructure. Now there's nothing like that. So we only the farmers are now. Therefore, the comment of this reform saying that we want to get new investments by regulating markets. As I said earlier, deregulation without a policy backup doesn't bring new investments. You need policy incentive for people to move in. Simply because you make it free for all doesn't mean that people will come and invest. So I think that is more than enough to say that deregulation alone, whether in Bihar or whole of India or any particular state, would not do what a policy is supposed to do. So don't ask deregulation or regulation to do the job of policy. These two are entirely different instruments of development. One is for regulation and protection of people's interests, especially weaker parties' interests. The other is to encourage people to invest for making profits. So that is the story. I only want to bring one comment before I answer the way forward for removing the deadlock. I have slight disagreement with Professor Himanshu when he says that middlemen are not bad. I've done a piece for the Outlook magazine 21st December dated issue, and I've done one piece for Frontline January 1st issue. See, it is not same everywhere. I think we need to recognize that the role of middlemen or the problem of middlemen also varies across states depending on where you are. Like the state of agrarian economy or markets varies across states. You have a state like Madhya Pradesh, which removed these middlemen from the mandis 35 years back. Yeah, they're able to do the business without them being there. Officially, at least there are no middlemen there in the markets. Outside they may be. Second, there is a problem of this middleman, which is called necessary evil now, and some people call it a service provider. Unfortunately, some of the unions are also doing that now. There is a serious problem in Punjab. I give you the reason why it is so serious. It is not that somebody is getting 2.5% commission or 1.5% commission or whatever. It is that they interlock other markets along with produce market. They interlock produce and credit market. They interlock input and output market, which are highly exploitative. Yeah, 30,000 families in Punjab are taking 10 lakh farmers of Punjab for a ride for the last 20 years. I tell you a simple case why they are free riding along with the political economy and capture of the state. For example, everybody, these students also may laugh when I say this. My students laugh and say what crazy things I'm talking about. When Himanshu sells his produce to Sukhpal Singh, who is FCI, Himanshu's payment goes to Richa Kumar. And this has been going on for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years in that so-called progressive state. Richa Kumar gets my payment, yes, or Himanshu's payment. When a farmer sells to FCI, his money goes to the Artiya in Artiya's name. And this has been an issue of direct payments in Punjab, which has not been tackled. 3 governments have come and gone. Only lip service has been paid. The issue is that Artiya is running an illegal and informal business of money lending, which is highly lucrative, ranging interest rates ranging from 18% to 36%. If now, why Artiya is a part of the farmers' protest now? Because if the new trade area takes away the produce, moves out of the mandi, including the FCI, how will they recover their loans? So I think let's not tie everything in one sort of way, saying that it's all same across the country. There are variations in the political economy of agricultural markets across India, because Punjab is different from Orissa, Orissa is different from Gujarat, Gujarat is different from Kerala. So there are issues. I don't want to call them service providers or necessary evil. Therefore, I say the solution to some of the problems lie actually outside the markets. Unless you bring adequately provided, fairly priced institutional finance to small and marginal farmers, they will not be able to benefit from whatever market reform you undertake, because this interlocking will continue directly or indirectly. So that is my take on this. Last part, how do we move forward? That's a very difficult question to answer, but the simple thing I have written also in this Outlook piece also. that since there have been so many violations of process, and also there are so many issues with the content of the acts, I think it's better to shelve them, yeah, keep them sort of in what I call suspension, yeah, yeah, uh, uh, yeah, they may be shelved, yeah. So kept under suspension until now. There's another problem we need to tackle here, because I read another piece from stalwarts of Indian economy today, which raises doubts again. Where are we headed? One is by Professor Arvind Panagria in the Times of India today, and response to that is by Kaushik Basu and Nirvikar Singh. See, Arvind Panagria saying everything is very good, it's nothing new, people have changed sides now. And Kaushik Basu and others saying that no, this is not good enough because it doesn't protect the farmer. The issue is nobody is going. Then Kaushik Basu and Nirvikar talk about going back to the drawing table, but they don't say whose drawing table. Should be same government of India drawing table or different state governments drawing tables? I think that's a question which need to be asked. So I think this hard question need to be. I think a lot of time we forget that it is not that simply because we have some acts in front of us, we just start reworking them because they are problematic. We should also see why they came about, and should we really start where they are now, or should we go back to the original situation? And as Professor Himanshu was also saying, let states take a call on it. Because Professor Arvind Panagria himself says 20 states have already amended their APMC acts, with 16 of them notifying rules and regulations before these acts came. So I also say we were almost there in reforming agricultural markets as seen by different states according to their requirements. So if we had waited for a year or two, we would have been there in terms of opening up channels for most of the farmers, because not many farmers sell across states. If interstate trade was an issue, that could have been tackled by the union government with a union list legislation. So there's no need to upset the entire apple cart by going whole hog and doing this. So the way forward is to put the sort of clock back, and let's see whether states now agree to speed up the process and do whatever is being required to integrate the market at the state as well as national level. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Supal. I'll answer the one question that was asked to me, which was on the way forward. And here, I think I want to again support what Professor Supal has already said, and also what Professor Himanshu has said, which is, the Mandi has been, like, my experience, of course, comes from Madhya Pradesh, where the Mandi has been a very strong institution. And when the Mandi works well, at least theoretically, the way it was designed, it is essentially a public space. So you have a public space where, farmers can come and protest, farmers can come and hold the state as well as traders accountable. And moving out from that public space into an entirely unregulated space, there is no mechanism for farmers to hold anybody who is the buyer accountable anymore. I mean, of course, you have oligopolies and mandis and all of that other concern, but in the new system there is absolutely no mechanism, given the whole PAN card issue that Professor Himanshu discussed. But even if you have a corporate buyer coming in there and settling in systems and creating a whole private marketplace, the rules of the private marketplace cannot be challenged by farmers. Farmers have either got to accept those rules or go somewhere else. And in the Mandi, there is a space for farmers to raise their voice through either the elected system or through, invoking other kinds of things. And historically, India has seen farmers, in fact, take up issues in various Mandis, especially in Madhya Pradesh, in terms of issues related to payment, issues related to payment. The other 2-3 things in terms of relevance to economic students, what Professor Himanshu was saying in terms of, there is a record in the Mandi of the transactions that have taken place. And, that is what also helps create what is known as a reference price. So in Madhya Pradesh, for example, private buyers who are buying are actually looking at the Mandi's reference price to set up their own prices of purchase. So when you dismantle the Mandi system, there is no reference price, there is no record, there is no payment settlement mechanism. When somebody has, everybody who has a license in the Mandi has given some deposit, so they can't run away with farmers' money. But here in the private marketplace, where is the mechanism to hold those entities accountable for actually making the payment to farmers? So all of these concerns are there. Upholding the existence of a public marketplace with, rules and regulations, and making that marketplace more competitive. I mean, there is no reason why we can't in fact open licenses and allow anybody who wants to buy within the mandi space. Why don't we get the startups and the corporates and everybody, if you want to buy, come into the mandi and buy? And why don't we make public investments into the smaller B and C class mandis, which have basically been defunct, or the 23,000 periodic rural hearts that we have? How do we in fact bring in public investment and actually bring the market closer to farmers? Because again, a majority of farmers are even unable to reach the mandi. So if we really want to give farmers some kind of support in the marketing space, we need to bring the market closer to them, the institutional market closer to them. So that would be certainly one way forward, other than the other issues I mentioned about thinking along the lines of ecology and reframing policies more fundamentally in agriculture to support that. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Sukhpal, about that comment on the middleman. I think we can do it one-to-one, but I'm just going to clarify on a few things. Yes, Punjab market mandi system has become a little, and one of the reasons is that for the last 40 years there has been no elections. And I think but I don't think that the fact of corruption in one particular place where elections have not been held is a system where, because I'll tell you, I did my fieldwork in Bihar, and there is also a case study that has been written by somebody else, a very, very good anthropological. What happened to the Artiyas or the middlemen in Bihar after 2006 when the APMC was repealed? They still continue to be the same. And they still charge 25% to 36% from the farmers, because they are the only ones who know what the farmers are growing, and they still have a contact. But at least compared to the previous one, the Artiyas and middlemen have not changed. They are doing exactly the same thing. And that is where I think the same thing is happening in UP also. That is the middleman system between, as far as the finance is concerned, is going to go up. And I think this is linked to the sort of suicide question also. There is an increasing mechanization and monetization of agricultural economy. And so the need for cash has gone up. And that is where the role of middleman has also gone up. So what is happening in Punjab it is being done by the middleman, it is being done by the Artiyas, but in other places, these things are worse, not being done by the middlemen or the erstwhile middlemen, whatever you call it. I think the solution are threefold. One is that we have to democratize our mandis, which are there in the law. In fact, in all the APMC acts, including the Punjab one, have a system of regular election, where he himself talked about. In other places also, there are farmer representatives, there are trader representatives, and there are government representatives which are there. You just have to make it democratic. The problem with taking a very personal and anecdotal view is basically what we had in during demonetization. I mean, when you had a demonetization, everybody knew that corruption is there, and everybody knew that people do stuff, notes in pillows and bed covers and everything. But the cost of reforming that actually turned out to be much, much more serious to the economy. And finally, we didn't find a single pillow where the money was stacked in. I think that we have to be more logical in terms of what we wish for and what kind of things that we get for. I think making the elections to APMC compulsory, making it more democratic, making it more participative, making it more transparent will be the first step. The second, again, I'm making it very clear that the only agency which is going to set up the market infrastructure is going to be the state. Private sector will not come in. They have never come in. They are not going to set up any kind of markets, because the cost of running a market and running a whole market exercise is huge, and no private sector will come and do it. So I think that's the state will have to take the responsibility. They will have to build markets everywhere, including in Bihar, including in Orissa, including in West Bengal, Eastern Uttar Pradesh, Assam, everywhere, not just in Punjab and Haryana and other places. The third, the entire MSP system has to change. The lazy way of buying stuff from Punjab, Haryana and Madhya Pradesh, or from say Chhattisgarh or Andhra Pradesh, has to change. You have to now start procuring from other states, and that is when diversification will happen. You will have to basically, not just in terms of regional diversification, but also crop diversification for a good dietary or good environmental. In fact, in economics, when we teach, we talk about something called the incentive prices. MSP is not something that has to be used every year. It is something which is an emergency tool which is invoked when prices go below the market prices. What we have come to now realize that the MSP and procurement prices and incentive prices and all other prices have basically been merged. And that, I think, has to break. We now have to create more, give more subsidy to the farmers for keeping the land, growing edible oil, millets, pulses, or any environmental practices. They need to be paid. Farmers need to be paid for those environmental practices. And that, I think, that should be part of the whole MSP policy. Diversifying it from other areas will reduce the dependence of the FCI and making them being blackmailed by one or two states or being completely dependent on one or two states is something that has to break. It's also much better because local procurement or decentralized procurement, which we had, is something which is much more beneficial to the farmer. So we have to diversify in terms of more crops to be brought under the public procurement net, but also more diversification in terms of regional spread of where the farmers are doing it. I think the third, I think what is being very, very important is one has to realize that just by procurement or just by Monday system, you cannot deal with a problem which is inherently of agriculture being a loss-making enterprise. And remember, our farmers are competing with European farmers or competing with American farmers or the Australian farmers and New Zealand farmers, where the level of subsidy is sometimes 10 times to 100 times more than that. If you want our farmers to compete, you have to do two things, and that state support has to come in. The state support has to come in the form of better investment, more investment in terms of not just irrigation, but also in terms of market infrastructure, storage, logistics, but also extension services, telling the farmers which fertilizer to use, what is to be done, providing them good quality. That is an investment that the state used to do and is not doing it. Second is providing investment in various other spheres of agriculture, new technology, new implements, and other things. And financial inclusion, again, the state will have to invest by making sure that the reign of the grip of the artiyas or grip of the middleman or the non-institutional sources is basically reduced. And I think that is where the state or the public sector banks or the mainstream banks will have to go to the banks. I mean, keep in mind, 1991 onwards, when the economy was liberalized, the number of rural bank branches actually went down. Number of rural bank branches actually went down. And then the percentage of non-institutional sources of finance, rural credit, actually went up by 2002-03 survey. So whereas you are focusing on the Jan Dhan accounts and other things, you have to create that financial infrastructure and make them part of the thing. And the fourth one, again, is you have to change your price policy. The price policy cannot be simply be that you are only going to buy rice and wheat. And that also you are doing it simply because there is an ANFSA that has been passed. You have to think of other sources. Had the government continued with procurement of pulses and edible oil, we will not be import dependent as we are currently. And if you want to know how the corporate interests actually subverted the entire agenda of edible oil, read the article that was written by the person who was in charge of from the NDDB for the Dhara, the government initiative of edible oil, and how the corporate sector went into creating a system where the entire edible oil support system was destroyed to facilitate importers, corporate importers, because they were importing and making money. So I think the corporate interest story is not so over. And remember, this bill was passed on a Sunday, where with a kind of knife on the neck, that you have to pass it because Monday something was happening. You'd want to know what has happened on Monday, go and read any business newspaper and see whose shares are bought at a very, very high prices. You will find the link of what is the corporate interest, what was the hurry on Sunday, and what was happening on Monday, and who gave promise to whom. That is also something which is very clear. So I think there are lots of angles, and somewhere money has to be pumped in. Institutions have to be created. APMC is one institution. It is going to be destroyed. We need more of these institutions to be created. Cooperatives, the kind of the existing institutions have to be strengthened. Without doing this, you can't deal with an agriculture. Remember, agriculture in 1950 is different from agriculture in 2020. Agriculture has changed, way of agriculture has changed, market has changed, it's linked with the internal world and outside world has changed, the rural-urban linkages have changed. We are still stuck with various of the policies which were designed in the 50s and 60s for a food-starved nation. We now have to think about modern agriculture. Unfortunately, there is no thinking that is happening at this point of time. Let me stop here.
Thank you so much for your informative comments on the questions. I would like to take up three more questions here, addressed first to Professor Kumar. That in rural India, the demand for money has increased. Now people need more money frequently than 10 years ago, maybe, for their health, education of children, etc. Hence, crop diversification towards the vegetables and horticulture is inevitable. Monocrop culture is also going to change. What is your comment on this? Let me take up another question, which is by Surbhi. Despite being a nation known for agricultural production, why farmers have always been neglected in development? Like in the digital discourse, they are lacking in resources for accessing the digital. How can the Habermas's concept, I'm sorry, I don't know the pronunciation, concept of public sphere would be helpful in developing an understanding about the above mentioned question? Um, Let me also raise one question to Professor Himanshu here. Would it be fair to share that the MSP Act has been flawed from the beginning? Wouldn't a better approach be to pay the farmer a basic income and is not connected to what the farmer is able to sell at the end of the day? I believe that happens in France via the Common Agricultural Policy. That is something Kumud Dablani has raised. So I don't know who to raise the second question related to digital discourse. So I open it up to reflection by all the three panelists. Thank you so much.
I think Professor Sukpal, you should begin.
Which one?
Anyone?
No, neglect of agriculture, yes. I think it has been global neglect of agriculture, and India is no exception since the last maybe 20 years, if not more, 25 years. And 2008 World Bank report had highlighted it and recognizes the role of agriculture by titling it Agriculture for Development. I think the neglect has been for the reason that the way we look at the GDP, saying that 40 or 45% people depending on 13.5% GDP. I have been arguing for a separate kind of different kind of paradigm or thinking on this, that if we can change our perspective, how we view agriculture, which has been now, I wrote about it first time in 2007 for Oxfam, but now World Bank has accepted it. They have written in their recent report that if you look at agriculture as any activity which involves agriculture raw materials, then even in India, we also have today even 25% of the GDP coming from agriculture. If you include all the further value-added stages of procurement, processing, distribution, retail, and so on, of food and fiber products, then agriculture is not doing that bad. And if we take that perspective, instead of being pessimistic, we can be very optimistic about the role of agriculture in development. Then you can even argue with the government saying, no, it's not just half of the people earning only 1/7. It is 40% people actually contributing 1/4. So it's not that bad. It's as good as manufacturing sector contribution, if not higher. So I think that kind of restructuring of our data and our perspective on understanding what agriculture is all about can change the rules of the game, and then government can think of bringing new investments on its own or by whatever the intended now stated purpose of bringing other types of investment, including corporate, into the sector. So that is much needed, whether in the production sector or in the marketing sector. Infrastructure is lacking, investments are lacking, no doubt about it. So that has been more by design rather by default in the past 15-20 years, which is likely to change now, because after the pandemic, agriculture is the only sector which has delivered. And also the way thinking is shifting to development rather than growth. I think people are recognizing that you need to, I personally feel that we need to keep people in agriculture for another 2 to 3 decades instead of throwing them out. There are a lot of reports, a lot of economists who think that we should reduce the dependence on agriculture. I personally feel we have not exploited the potential of agriculture fully. Agriculture can give much more in terms of employment and incomes. We need to invest. I have no issues with the India's small farm size. A lot of people have this crazy idea saying these are too small to be viable, and therefore we need to expand the size of the farm. I feel that small farm is beautiful size, and government of India actually ended up calling them handkerchief size farms, which I call is an insult to the Indian small farmer. They are doing the best possible job. They are the most efficient producers compared to any other category of farmers. So issue is not production. Issue is when they have to go to the market to buy or to sell. That's where they lose. So we need to tighten that part of the sort of thoughts by investing as well as restructuring institutions, that Professor Himanshu said, not just APMC. There are many more institutions which need to create and support. FPO is one route to that, but many more can be thought of. We have PACs which have been there. In fact, in many states, they're playing a useful role, but somehow government is not looking at them as entity which can still deliver. In Punjab, they're running 1,500 farm mechanization rental service centers. And in Bihar, they have been procuring for the government. In UP, they have been procuring. Madhya Pradesh, they have been procuring. Chhattisgarh, they have been procuring. So we have institutions which are there on the ground, which are relevant, but we have not cared to bring them into the loop. So that needs to be done. I think I'll stop here instead of attending to the MSP question. I have my own views on that, but maybe I'll leave it to Himanshu to attend to that.
Okay, I'll respond to 2 or 3 of the questions that were made. But before that, one point I just wanted to emphasize is that, the whole discussion on middlemen that has happened, the corporate buyers or the startups who are coming into the space, they are middlemen themselves. I mean, that is something that, this entire discourse is sort of positioning them as though, they are coming in to save the consumer and, save the farmer. But effectively, like Professor Himanshu said, every economic activity has middlemen in it. You need intermediation of some kind or the other. Corporates themselves are intermediaries. Now the question is, how accountable can we make them to the needs of farmers as well as to the needs of consumers? And we have institutional mechanisms, as already been explained. How do we strengthen those institutional mechanisms to create more accountability? So that is just a point related to the earlier discussion. Regarding this need for cash, I think this is a very, very important point that you have raised, especially in the last 10-20 years with the withdrawal of the state from the provision of education, from the provision of health services. This need for cash has really increased. And one of the primary reasons for rural debt, I mean, of course, apart from all of the terrible economics that's happening in terms of, lower prices and higher costs, a lot of the money that rural households in fact are spending is being spent on adverse health incidents that take place, and also on private education. So this is sort of a much larger issue and concern that needs to be looked at in a much more holistic manner, if we are concerned only with growth and not, as Professor Sukhpal Singh said, with the larger concerns around welfare and development. If we shift our lens to the larger concerns of welfare and development, then all of these things also need to be brought on board in terms of thinking about the overall welfare, of course, of our children and of the larger workforce over the next 20-30 years. Regarding this, again, just taking off from what Professor Sukhpal said about having people remain in agriculture, I think there is certainly a lot that can be done in agriculture, especially if we look towards shifting to other forms of farming practices where labor is really essential. Whether natural farming practices or organic farming practices. So there is a lot of scope within agriculture, of course, to provide livelihoods. But I think what is very important for us to recognize is the non-agricultural space in rural areas. So we are assuming that the rural is only about agriculture. But in fact, if you go back and look historically at our country, 400 years back, even before that, we have had a very vibrant agro-industrial space. I mean, 400 years back, we used to export a great deal of cloth. If we were like 25% of the global GDP, as has been argued by economic historians, a lot of that was coming from value addition of products coming from agriculture and into export markets and other kinds of markets. So the whole artisanal, non-agricultural allied rural space also needs to be looked at. Typically, our framing, the economic framing, the Lewisian model is that you kick out people from agriculture, push them into industry or push them into service because that's supposed to be developed and more advanced and all of that. But in some senses, Why is it that we need to consider any one sector of economic activity as backward or below another sector? These are all important economic activities. In fact, agriculture is feeding us. Without food, none of us will in fact exist. So agriculture should be considered, in fact, one of the most important contributors to our welfare, to the welfare of everybody. So how do we reframe our thinking about agriculture and the rural being this residual, sort of this redundant category? Even farmers' children don't want to be farmers anymore, because so much of it is also associated with backwardness and with poverty and with, the aspirations are to move into something else. How do we transform those aspirations and the rural and agricultural space is something positive, meaningful? How do we think about work in agriculture and in the rural space as meaningful work? So these are some of the larger cultural questions that we also need to begin to consider as we think of agriculture and the rural as places for positive employment. And the last bit, just very quickly on the digital question, I want to use that opportunity to talk to you guys just a little bit about something that is known as AgriStack, which is now the new database that is being developed along a health stack and a whole variety of other databases about farmers and information about them. And of course, the idea is that when you have information about farmers in these large scale databases, then one can target precise information to farmers about, say, precision agriculture, or the kinds of crops they should grow, or the kind of fertilizers they should use. But a very large set of concerns are also stemming around these kinds of projects like AgriStat, because there's very little consent of farmers that is being taken, or very little informed consent. In particular, farmers really have no idea that their information is being put on, land holding, on debt, on credit, a whole host of things. And there are larger concerns that, just like Facebook monetized us, so it's our data that's on Facebook, that Facebook is in fact selling to advertisers and making money off of that. So the advertisers are then sending us ads and we are buying it. This data in AgriStat is in fact also generating value addition. So the data of farmers is potentially being used for various kinds of other value generation and in other kinds of spaces. So the digitalization in agriculture is something that really requires huge amounts of study. And so if there are PhD students here in the meeting, please consider taking up some of these issues for doing further research. And that's really a point of concern. And I'll stop here.
Okay, so I think both of them have made it very clear. So I think not much to answer, but I'll just say that the information is an important part of it. I mean, the whole, and I think the mandis played a very important role. I don't know how many of you have looked at the vernacular, the district newspapers. I mean, in the most of the district newspapers, if the daily prices of agricultural commodities in the mandis are published, and that's what used to be. So the APMC mandis used to play what we call as the price settler. I mean, they were the price setters. So the prices will become like a benchmark prices. And again, something that is very important. But I think information to the farmers, not just about agricultural practices, availability of markets and everything, is very important. I think we need to go into it, and digital is something where the way to go. But we need to be careful about what Richa was saying, is that just to not be just in a sense where we allow our data to be misused and farmers' data to be misused. I think the MSP system question is a complicated one, and just end by saying that the MSP as a concept is a concept which is there in most countries. The only thing that is to be kept in mind is that MSP needs to be, it's called minimum support prices. You invoke it only when the market prices are lower than a predetermined price. That's something which is kept in mind. What has happened today is not an MSP. It is a price what we call generally as a procurement prices. Now, procurement prices are different from MSP, minimum support prices. Today, the distinction between these two have been almost has disappeared. So government is using MSP as the procurement prices, which is to basically procure for the and the government does announce MSP for 23 crops. It hardly buys many of these crops, including some of the millets. It never buys all of these crops at the MSP. So I think the MSP system needs to be worked out. The needs for a food security apparatus, the National Food Security Act, again, that's a different challenge, but that is linked to the agricultural production. That's a challenge which has to be looked into and has to be merged. But I don't think the solution of that is to use the MSP system or use the FCI in a way which is detrimental to the agricultural economy. Keep in mind, today we have almost 100 million tons in our agricultural stocks. Nobody asked the government to procure so much of it. So the government cannot blame the Punjab farmers for having produced and then having gone and procured. They did it because they wanted it for own political purpose. Our requirements do not require so much of the FCI. So it's a politicized atmosphere. It is a politicized tool, and I think that needs to be brought out and has to be kept in reformed in a way where it caters to the need of food security. It caters to the need of the farmers. It caters to the need of the agricultural system, environmental system, as well as the resources, natural resources that which I was talking about. I think those are things very, very important. I mean, if you tell Punjabi farmers that you will get money for growing pulses on MSP and government will buy the same amount that is buying, they will happily do that. I mean, the problem is that they shifted to cotton. The problem is that last 2 years, cotton prices have collapsed. The only one that you are willing to buy is the paddy, and that also because the NFSA was passed. Had the NFSA not been passed and you had to shift it into cash transfer, which is what the government wanted to do, then even they would have actually stopped growing paddy. I think the question is that what kind of incentives you are giving, what kind of institutional structures you are using. We need a huge restructuring of the entire institutional structure, the support mechanism that is provided by the state. It cannot be simply be MSP. You have to talk about inputs. You have to talk about technology. You have to talk about research. Indian Council of Agriculture Research didn't have a director for 20 years. I mean, the primary research agency didn't have a director. I mean, you are talking about agriculture and Annadatta and all sorts of lofty languages. And the whole Indian agricultural research system has collapsed in the last 10 years. I mean, agriculture universities have are not functioning. There is no money being given to them. The staff are not being appointed. No, so I think there are a whole lot of issues that we need to talk about when we are talking about. As of now, I think the issue is a temporary issue, but simply because the farms have, I mean, these laws have been enacted and the Punjab and Haryana farmers are angry and many others are angry. Bihar farmers obviously don't know what has happened to them because 15 years back what existed, they don't have a clue about it. But not that they're not angry and they're not suffering out of it. But I'm saying that even if the laws are removed, the problems are not going to go away. You will have farmers coming back on street, this time for something else. 2 years back, they were on loan waivers. Sometimes they were for something else. Today, they are here for the markets. Tomorrow, there will be another subsidy and other support. But I think the issue of agriculture and profitability in agriculture, remuneration in agriculture, if you don't deal with those ones, then also these tidbits are not going to help. And final one line, which is what I think is most people say that about people being in agriculture, not being in agriculture. Look, it's nobody's choice. I mean, our wishes that people should stay in agriculture or people should go in non-agriculture, the point that Richa was talking about is very valid. I mean, younger generation, if he has to continue with agriculture, they need to see agriculture as a viable business. You can't be doing whatever you want to do in non-agriculture sector and tell them that, look, you have a job to keep the agriculture sector and be nostalgic because we want an agriculture sector and say that Bharat ek krishi pradhan desh hai. That's not how it works. And this is something, if you really want agriculture to be helped, then you have to be willing to pay higher prices for agricultural produce, willing to contribute or allow the government to have more subsidies being given to the agriculture sector. Then tomorrow don't come and say that I'm a taxpayer and that guy doesn't pay tax, then why subsidize him? You can't have it both ways. So I think some ways the agriculture sector needs to be supported by the government, by the public at large, by the middle class, who is beneficiary of low prices of agriculture sector, and the corporate sector and the non-agricultural sector, because they benefit because of the cheap wages that they get out of the agricultural sector. So everybody is dependent on that. And I think it's time that we prioritize agriculture, but not in terms of being some charity, but rethinking of the way agriculture is changing, modernizing, restructuring, respecting the changes in agriculture sector, and then finding ways of working out around those issues. I think I'll stop here.
Thanks a lot to the panel. I can say that on behalf of the audience and the development study group that this discussion has really been very insightful. The panel was followed by quite enriching questions, and I'm very glad that we could make this event a success. I thank the panel for their generosity in terms of their time, and we will be able to find this event recorded on the blog and the Facebook page of the DSD group. I am really thankful to the panel, and we won't be able to take up any more questions given the interest of time. So let's all wrap up here, and thank you so much for being a part of this event. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye bye. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot. Thank you, sir.